Jasmine walked into the bank, minding her own business, just like she had done countless times before. But today, everything was different. Without warning, a police officer grabbed her arm, yanking her from her seat and dragging her out the door. Accused of fraud, she was confused, terrified, and stunned. Little did the officer know, Jasmine wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just an ordinary customer. She was an undercover FBI agent, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What happens next will shake you to your core. Stay tuned to see how this explosive situation unravels. Jasmine's life had always been full of obstacles, but she had worked hard to rise above them. At 24, she had established herself as a young, successful financial analyst in a city that often tried to shut people like her down. Her apartment, though small, was a sanctuary, a place where she could recharge after a long day of overcoming barriers. Jasmine was proud of where she had gotten, the work ethic that had gotten her there, and the few close friends who had stood by her side. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that morning. It was just a routine visit to the bank, a simple deposit, the same errand she had done 100 times before. But as soon as she stepped through the doors, something felt off. The air seemed to buzz with a strange tension. She could feel it, the eyes that followed her. A glance here, a whisper there. Jasmine shrugged it off, too used to the uncomfortable looks that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. She walked to the counter, completed her transaction, and turned to leave, and that's when the officer grabbed her. The sudden force of his hand on her arm took her completely by surprise. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his grip tight. "Can you come with me?" "Why?" Jasmine asked, her confusion rising. "You're being detained for fraud," he said, the words cold and blunt. Fraud? Jasmine's mind raced. Fraud? She hadn't done anything wrong. But as she looked around, she realized the whispers had grown louder. The eyes that had been on her were now filled with suspicion. This wasn't just an accusation. This was something much more sinister, something Jasmine had experienced countless times before, racial profiling. But it didn't matter how many times she had seen it, it still hit her like a punch to the gut. Jasmine tried to speak up, to explain, but the officer wasn't listening. He just kept dragging her toward the door, ignoring her protests. "Let me go," she said, but her voice was swallowed by the growing noise of confusion and disbelief around them. She was being treated like a criminal in front of an audience of strangers, the very people who had quietly observed her since she walked in. Outside, the officer's grip remained firm, pulling her farther from the safety of the building and toward the harsh daylight. Jasmine felt trapped, but she wouldn't let them do this to her. She had been prepared for situations like this. But no amount of preparation could protect her from the visceral anger rising in her chest. How many times had she been judged by the color of her skin? How many times had she been forced to prove she belonged? The crowd had gathered, some curious, others whispering among themselves, but no one spoke up. They just watched. Jasmine's pulse raced, frustration boiling over. She knew what was happening here. She knew why she was being targeted. It wasn't about fraud. It was about race, pure and simple. And the worst part was, no one was willing to say anything. As the officer pulled out handcuffs, Jasmine's mind raced. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever faced unfair treatment, every person who had been unfairly judged, every person who had been made to feel less than. But no one knew what she really was, they just saw her as another black woman, suspect, without giving her the chance to speak for herself. Jasmine needed to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been caught in this cycle. "Let me speak to my lawyer," she demanded, her voice calm, but the anger simmering beneath it was impossible to ignore. But the officer just sneered. "Save it," he muttered, continuing to pull her along. Jasmine's mind was spinning. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. And just as the situation began to escalate, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Her heart skipped. The cavalry was coming, but would they make it in time to stop what was already happening? The sound of the sirens grew louder, and Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest. The officer kept his grip on her, but his confidence wavered. He glanced nervously over his shoulder as a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out, tall, composed, and dressed in a suit. It was Agent Carter, Jasmine's supervisor, along with another agent. Jasmine felt a flood of mixed emotions. She wasn't sure whether to feel relief or fury. "Jasmine," Agent Carter called, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "You're with me. Let her go." The officer froze. The second officer shifted uneasily, glancing at his partner, unsure of what to do next. Agent Carter walked up to them, his face hard, his presence commanding. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the officers began to realize their mistake. The officer who had dragged Jasmine out of the bank tried to speak, to explain, but his words came out weak. She was causing a disturbance," he stammered. Agent Carter turned to him, his eyes dark with frustration. "No. She wasn't. You'll be lucky if this doesn't cost you your job." Jasmine stood tall, her hands still behind her back, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had been through worse before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't going to let them get away with it. She turned to the officer, her voice calm but piercing. "You don't get to do this to me. Not today. Not ever again." The officer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His power, his misplaced sense of authority, crumbled in the face of Jasmine's strength. And just like that, it was over. Or so Jasmine thought. But as the officer backed away, the manager of the bank stepped forward. His eyes locked onto Jasmine's with a sneer that made her blood boil. "Do you think this is over?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. Jasmine didn't even look back. "It's just beginning," she replied. "And you'll remember my name." The fallout from the incident spread far and wide. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. Jasmine's case quickly gained national attention. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded, and voices from every corner of the country rallied behind her. The video, captured by a bystander, went viral, showing the officers' blatant disregard for Jasmine's rights. The officers were eventually fired, and Jasmine filed a lawsuit against the police department for racial discrimination and wrongful arrest. The case set a new precedent, and the department was forced to implement new policies on racial profiling and officer accountability. The bank, which had stood by silently, was forced to confront its own biases and institute mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. But Jasmine's fight wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about shedding light on a broken system that continued to treat people like her as expendable. She became a powerful voice for those who had suffered in silence, and her case sparked a wave of change, not just in the police force or the banking system, but across the entire nation. Her journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, but Jasmine had proven that one person's voice could create a ripple effect, a movement that could not be ignored. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, had given others the courage to stand up for themselves, too. As the screen faded to black, Jasmine's words echoed in the silence. "Don't ever let anyone silence your voice. The fight for justice may be long, but it's worth it. And when you stand up, you stand for everyone who can't."